So I wanted to quickly raise 5 kind of general points. The first one is the question of why we're all gathering to talk about these topics. And it's something somebody said, I think it might be Deborah Nicholson. She said, policy is the new licensing. And so what I take from this is that there were always people who were interested in like the legal framework of free and open source software in our ecosystem. And it's quite a niche topic. Most people want to make sure it has as little as possible impact on their lives, but there's always people who are interested. And so we used to think about the legal framework of our software by writing down different things in our licenses. And so there might have been a code of conduct or maybe some trademark policy, but the vast majority of the discussion was, what are these terms that we're going to put in our licenses? And it was very much a discussion internal to each project or each sub-ecosystem. And that, in one way, it kind of got settled because a lot of these decisions got taken, and we got past. We settled on a certain few number of licenses, but then also we started having all this regulation coming from the outside that now affects us. And so now, if you want to do the same work that was being done by the licensing people 10, 20 years ago, policy is the new area for doing that same thing. So policy is maybe it's a broader topic, but it is more or less replaced and swallowed what we used to call licensing discussions. So we now have all this regulation. We have the CRA, which we'll talk about almost exclusively today, but I also just want to mention that there are other pieces of legislation. And so when we were working on the CRA, we were also concerned about the AI Act and the Product Liability Directive, and we didn't really have time to get into those to the extent that we wanted to. We possibly got lucky on, in particular, the Product Liability Directive, because a lot of the good work we were doing on the Cyber Resilience Act, there were people in the Parliament, and they might even be in this room, who were taking the good ideas from our CRA work and inserting those or suggesting those for the Product Liability Directive. And so we ended up doing, being able to influence those other projects almost indirectly. But in the near future, there's also going to be a revision of the CHIPS Act, for example, which will decide to what extent the European Union will support or embrace open hardware. There will be a review of the standards regulation 1025, which is the contract, more or less, between the European Commission and the standards bodies that we're having to put in so much effort to try and ensure that our needs are taken into account. We got some things into the Cyber Resilience Act which required that the standards bodies would would consult the free and open source ecosystem, but those clauses are specific to the Cyber Resilience Act. So to ensure that we're able to participate in future standardization procedures, it may be necessary to get something in at the EU level or to repeat this effort for each piece of legislation. There will also be the Cybersecurity Act, which is going to be revised, and this is a very interesting one because it deals with supply chains, and this is a concept that I think needs to be far better understood by the policymakers in particular. But it's not. I don't like presenting things as a lack of understanding from their side. It's something that we have to make easy to understand, because there is a certain older model of software development which was kind of similar to physical hardware, where software was developed in a company and a release was made when it was judged to be time, and the number of releases was a decision that management took. And really, now we have what would still be called a supply chain, but in free and open source software, you can have the end customer then developing and commercializing and possibly even selling the project back up to upstream. And you can have people who are from one point of view in the supply chain, but aren't even aware that this supply chain exists and wouldn't themselves accept the idea that they're part of this supply chain. So the whole concept, if it's not well understood, we could end up with some regulation that's very difficult to work with. So in the context of the Cybersecurity Act, we'll have to talk about what it means for free and open source software to be in a supply chain. And then there's also the things like the public procurement directives, which will possibly create a way that we can finance our projects and generally increase the stability of the finances of our ecosystem. And there will be, there's a long list. There's 10 or so other things that I have on my list, but there's also there's going to be things that pop up that we're not expecting. So there is a lot of work to get in early and make sure that the next thing that could turn into a CRA doesn't turn out to be as difficult as the CRA was to work with. So when we're dealing with all these different projects, it's also important that we focus on the quality of our work. And this is something that we're actually doing very well on, and in particular in Europe. At the Open Source Congress last month, we had a discussion about the other parts of the world, and what could Europe learn from other parts of the world that had similar problems. And we realized, despite the shortcomings and the things that we still need to do, we're actually quite advanced, and we're ahead of the rest of the world in almost every way in terms of organizing and being able to respond and being able to coordinate with each other and form a coherent policy. So we're doing quite well in that sense. But there was an interesting point from somebody from the public sector, and they said that open source is a black box. And I think this, it took a few seconds for people to understand it, but the point was that if we come to the policymakers and if we have two different positions, and that might be based on, the foundations might have a position and the SMEs might have a different position, or the single vendor free software might have one position and community projects might have a different position. If we present two positions to the policymakers, they don't have the understanding to be able to figure out how to merge these two proposals, or which of these two is valid, or which of these two represents other parts of the sector that didn't participate in the procedure. And so we really need to have a single position on a lot of topics. And that doesn't mean that we go all the way back from the bazaar to the cathedral. The diversity and the different forms that projects take in our ecosystem is really important, and that's something that we absolutely have to preserve. But there are certain layers within the ecosystem where that's important, and then there's going to be an interface with the policymakers where at some point we have to settle on something that is coherent and unified, that we can communicate to the policymakers. And so the difficulty might seem that, well, how do we get agreement when there's disagreement on so many different topics? But my own experience has been that we haven't disagreed fundamentally on very much at all in the last 3 years working on the Cyber Resilience Act. I did think of 3 examples. I'm not going to go through all 3, but in general, the solution to this disagreement was simply having everyone talking in the same group or in the same calls or in the same forums. And in general, people might start off with different points of view, but there is an understanding that there is mutual benefit to each party having their needs catered for. And so there is, the will is always there. And as long as we get all our different parts of our ecosystem talking to each other, I've found, my experience has been that we find the disagreements tend to go away quite quickly. So this is something we just have to think about in terms of organizing and making sure that we don't present a confusing situation to policymakers, which they would then see as a black box. And so then the fourth issue that I think is worth thinking about is that the obligations of the CRA, they're going to be challenges for everyone, but they are going to be more challenging for the smaller entities than for the bigger entities. So in general, of all the foundations that are going to be working on CRA compliance, Eclipse, for example, will be in the group of foundations that will have an easier time than some of the smaller foundations. And so in this sense, it's something we have to keep in mind, because the better financed foundations are also the foundations which are able to turn up to events like this, and which are likely to have legal staff or policy staff, or can find a consultant, or and so there's a risk that if we don't think about this and make an active effort, there's a risk that we end up with the people who are playing on easy mode all are getting together and deciding what's best for the people who play on easy mode, when actually we need to make sure that the dynamic is that the people who have more finances to work on this are going to make a system that is either equally good for people who are less well financed, or even more, focus on them, with the understanding that if life is easy for them, that makes it easier for us as well, when we're for the foundations who are better financed. So this is something we're going to have to make an effort for and try and figure out. How do we get involvement from the smaller foundations and projects? And the first step is kind of the easy bit, like how do you find them all? And Gail mentioned earlier that there are foundations working with us now that we didn't even know they existed a year ago. And so we have to find all these foundations, but that's the easy part. The next thing then is to actually get them to participate in a meaningful way, and by that I mean to be confident enough in being able to ask questions and to know what they need to be asking questions about. We need to do some kind of onboarding and education work to help them get involved, and so that when they think about the CRA, they don't have to start from scratch each time and do all the education work on their own and then ask their question. We need to process all the information so that it's easy for them to quickly learn what is going to be the outcome, or what the effects of the CRA will be, so then they can ask questions, and then we can have a forum, maybe specific even to the smaller entities. So if anyone has thoughts on that, or if anyone has ideas for foundations and projects that need to be included, definitely get in contact with me today or after the event. And then just the final thing I wanted to mention is, I think there hasn't been much discussion of the international situation of the CRA in terms of, sorry, not specifically the CRA, but if other parts of the world are inspired by the CRA to create similar legislation with a similar objective. There's two ways this could go. One way would be that they develop their own set of obligations, and that is usually the default way that these things work, because countries like to write their own laws and have their own style, and if they can look at something that already exists, then they'll look at the flaws or the shortcomings in that, and then they'll see if they can do better. But the problem there is that if we have 10 different regions and each has 10 different sets of obligations, then this becomes very difficult for any project to comply with all the obligations and then be able to develop and commercialize the world over. We can even end up with a situation where you have contradictory obligations. You might have one country saying, if you have a vulnerability, you have to inform us before anyone else, and then you might have a second country that has the same obligation, and then, well, how do you comply with these two at the same time? But the more common problem would be that if we have 10 obligations for Europe and 10 for some parts of Asia and 10 for North America, you may find that some projects will say, I can't do all 30, I'm going to focus on Europe and Asia, and some other project might say, I'm going to focus on North America and Asia. And then the problem is, if you merge those two projects, then you can't distribute in Europe because you don't have the documentation for half of the project in Europe, and you can't distribute in North America. You can only distribute in Asia, where you have the documentation for both projects. So the outcome would be that we'd have more and more obligations and fewer places where you could actually distribute and commercialize the software. So that's the worst case scenario. So then there's two ways to avoid this. One is that we can ask other countries that if they are considering having something like the CRA, that they do something that is compatible with the CRA. And so that, it can be difficult because of the reasons I mentioned, that countries like to develop their own laws for these sort of things. So we'll have to try and present the CRA as something that we'll have to present our compliance efforts as something that is really useful and something that would achieve the goals of increasing cybersecurity. And so if we can do this, then maybe we can convince people not to copy the entire CRA, but to look at it and take some parts. And so if the approach they took was take the good, leave the bad, then we could have other parts of the world that would have a subset of the CRA in their legislation. And in that case, by complying with the CRA, you would automatically also comply with all these other pieces of legislation around the world. Not an easy thing to do, but this is just one of the ways we can avoid this regulatory fragmentation. The second way is also not easy. The second way is that there is an Article 34 in the Cyber Resilience Act which says that the European Commission can sign mutual recognition agreements with third countries. And so this might be a way that we can work with other countries that have a completely different law. We may be able to get the European Commission to agree that we accept their law as ticking the boxes of the CRA, and they will accept the other way around. From talking to people initially about this, it sounds like it is quite a complex procedure in the legislative sense, in that you have to have some way to enforce or to check and to verify that compliance in the other country is actually sufficient. And so, you know, it's not as simple as technical people from one and technical people from the other both agreeing that they're doing the same thing. So these are just international things that we'll have to worry about. So I hope my presentation didn't add too many extra complications to all the thoughts we have about not just the CRA but also the other pieces of legislation that are being worked on in the European Union. But as I said, we are actually quite well organised. It is quite successful, the work we've been doing in the past, in particular in the past 4 years, I'd say. We've gotten a lot of recognition from the European Parliament, the European Commission, the Council. We get their time, which is generally, that's how you judge that you're actually being a useful part of the process. If they're talking with you, then that means that they see it worthwhile to give their time to talk to you. So things are going quite good. We have a lot more work. When the CRA is done, if it's ever going to be done, there will be a lot more to work on. So I look forward to continuing and working with you all on the CRA, but also all these other topics. Thank you very much.